Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. We're technically the afternoon. My name is Christopher Sands. I'm Director of the Center for Canadian Studies here, and we're very pleased to have an outstanding panel to talk about the Alberta oil curtailment order, which took effect on the 1st of January. So this is ripped from the headlines, have a chance to see how it's working. We have a terrific panel for you. I'll just introduce everybody up front and in the order that they're going to present. I should also tell you, just as a housekeeping matter, that we're recording the event on video, just so you know. And also, we did order vegetarian sandwiches. I know somebody has mentioned that, and Star is working on bringing them. So if she comes in with sandwiches and you're interested in a vegetarian sandwich, she's the person to look for when she comes in. So our first speaker today is Andrew Stanley, who's an Associate Fellow of the Energy and National Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, working primarily on oil and gas research. Andrew previously worked for the Consumer and Industrial Markets Tax Practice at KPMG in Ireland, and then in the Treasury Department of Royal Dutch Shell in London. So a lot of experience that he's brought to us here, making not his North American debut, but certainly his SAIS debut, so we're glad to have you here. I'm going to embarrass him just to note that Jesse Barnett also works with Andrew at CSIS and had a hand in all the research, and he is a proud alum of the ERE program here at SAIS. So there is a future for those of you who are working towards it. And he's a great person. Also, Liam Stone here is the Managing Director for the Government of Alberta's Washington office, which he joined in 2013. He's been with the Alberta Government since 2005, although you hopped in and out of federal. Would you say
2003?
2003? All right.
Jumped in and out.
Yes, he did go in and out. I'll try to cover some of that here. He served in several roles, including with provincial ministries of international intergovernmental affairs, health and wellness, and also energy. He has also worked for Canada's federal government as a senior policy advisor to the Ministers of Environment Canada and also intergovernmental affairs. He has a yes, so he's here. And then lastly, we'll have Charles Doran. As many of you know, Charles Doran is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor of International Relations and Director of both the Global Theory and History program and the program we have here in Canadian Studies. Before joining the SAIS faculty in 1979, impressive. He was Director of International Relations at Rice University, and just a plug, he teaches a very popular course here. Some of you may be in it, Facing the Oil Problem, the U.S., Canada, OPEC, and the World, which just had its first meeting this morning. So for those of you who came on the spur of the moment, well done. Also, in case some of you haven't read it, I pulled this off my shelf. Professor Doran is the author of this fine book, Myth, Oil, and Politics, Introduction to the Political Economy of Petroleum, which he wrote in 1977, and was for many years the standard text for people studying oil markets. Since then, there have been newer books, but none, I think, as good. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Andrew, to get started.
Let me just go from here or go?
I think that works. Well, if you would like to do that. Yes, you should be able to go from here, and the arrow should be able to advance it. Let me know if it doesn't.
Yeah, so just first, thank you very much, Chris, for organizing what I'm sure all of us up here would call a very important discussion. So I've just centralized my presentation about the question of whether this intervention will work by the Government of Alberta. And so just to provide the top line up front, in my assessment, I believe that it has been successful so far, and it has provided temporary relief, and it will continue to provide relief in 2019. But ultimately, the longer term success of this intervention will depend on whether pipelines get built over the longer run. And so just before going into the details of exactly what happened in 2018, just to take a step backwards.
Try to the right. You're right there. Yeah, all right. So try that one. If that doesn't work, I'll stay in here. Oh, there you go. Cool.
So yeah, just to contextualize things first, I think is important. Alberta is really at the tail end of the continent, and it's isolated. It's difficult to get crude production from Alberta down to the areas of demand, really, which is in the Midwest and the Gulf Coast, where primarily crude oil from Canada is processed and turned into refined petroleum products. And so 95% of oil production comes from Alberta, and 99% of all those exports go to the US. And so this means that Canadian oil is generally discounted for two main reasons. One is on a quality basis. It's a heavier, sour type of crude that is more difficult to process, and so it trades at a discount for that reason. The other reason really is the transportation cost of getting the oil from that area down to the areas of demand. And so 2018 was a really bad year for the discounts of Canadian oil. This graph here just shows the discounts over the year, and it's comparing it to the US benchmark, West Texas Intermediate. And so the first one is mixed wheat blend, and mixed wheat blend is a similar type of crude to West Texas Intermediate in terms of quality. And so we can see that generally there's a slight discount because of the transportation costs, but we can see how bad things got from September, October. The barrels were being discounted over $30 a barrel. And the middle one is Western Canadian Select. This is generally the oil sands, which comes from oil sands, and it's you can see there was the first period, the start of the year, the discount was pretty bad, and then this dramatic period in September, October. But you know, this problem is not being confined to 2018. It's been ongoing for a long time. And we can see here from this graph, this is just once again West Texas Intermediate and Western Canadian Select compared against each other since 2009. And the blue bars at the bottom here show the difference in the price level between the two. And we can see there's some really bad periods in 2012, 2013. And then for the past few years, it hasn't been that bad, but it got really bad again in 2018. And because the price level was relatively low, the Canadian producers really felt that impact compared to the period in 2012 to 2013 when we had $100 a barrel. And so just to try and break it out between the quality and the transportation cost, you can see here from the piece I've added here, the purple area, the pink area. This is I've used a proxy, which is Maya Mexican crude, which is a very similar type of crude to Western Canadian Select. And often it's a direct substitute that refiners in the US take in over Canadian or Venezuelan. And so that can kind of show us generally what the discount on a quality basis is. And so, as I said, 2011, 2012, it was a really bad period because of export constraints. But we can see just at the end here, 2018, it was really a really bad period, primarily because of transportation constraints. And so this is really what happened. This graph here shows takeaway capacity for each pipeline from Western Canada into the US. And at the top we have rail capacity as well. And you see crude available for export was continuing to grow from 2016, 17, and onwards into 18, but at the same time no pipeline capacity additions were made. And so we eventually ran up against these periods. The first was the start of the year. One very tight period which led to large inventory builds. And then towards the end of 2018, we had a crude available for export exceeding maximum level of pipeline capacity. And as a result, we had all these distressed barrels that had nowhere to go. And so the problem got really bad because essentially a triple whammy of factors converged at the same time. And the first one was that Albertan exports were ramping up from September through November. And at the same time, US refinery demand began to fall in September. It had a slight rebound in November, but the problem was inventories reached the capacity, full level of capacity in Alberta. And so really that level was really reached about September. So the barrels essentially had nowhere to go. The only possibility was to put it on rail and try and get it out of the province somehow. And so the Government of Alberta announced a decision to intervene in the market. first they announced that they're going to make investments in rail capacity, but really the big announcement came when they said that they were going to intervene and introduce a curtailment. And so the ultimate goal of the curtailment really is to reduce inventory levels, to get them back to the normal average level, which seems to be about the level they were in 2015 and 2017. As I said, that was a period when the discount wasn't too bad, things were pretty normal. And so we have here is we have inventories, just showing the inventory build up, what happened in 2018, reached that maximum level. We can see the spike in the differential between WTI and WCS. I can see the correlation between the inventory movements and the differential. And so for forecasting this out based on the curtailment, we expect to see that inventories will be at about their average level come March or April, upon which time the government has said that they will reduce the cut from 325,000 barrels a day to 95,000 barrels a day. And that will extend through the end of the year. And so taking a quick look at what this will mean for the next 2 years, you can see that the cut brings us back into a comfortable range of pipeline takeaway capacity, and things get tight again once they relax the cut, but really that will sustain them until the end of 2019, and there's the expectation that a new pipeline will come online, the replacement of Line 3, and that will add additional pipeline capacity. And so moving into 2020, the curtailment adds, and the forecast outwards from CAP does show us though that eventually come the end of 2020, there will be a need for additional pipeline capacity. And so really the medium and long-term solution is for pipeline capacity to be added. And so the first one, Line 3, I said, is really critical that it comes on in November 2019. You know, there are some appeals filed, but really looks like that the pipeline will go ahead and will be built. The second one then is Keystone XL, which you all know about, is facing massive problems, legal challenges. But TransCanada is still expecting to begin construction in June 2019 and for it to come online by early 2021. And so this pipeline will be really critical if we're to avoid the same problem again. And then the final one is the Trans Mountain Expansion Project, which construction has been halted temporarily, but the expectation is that it could come online by 2022 if things go smoothly from here on out. Just to bring it back then into the bigger picture, the outlook for Canadian heavy oil demand is actually very positive. There's a big announcement yesterday. The US announced sanctions on Venezuela, which is a comparable type of oil. It's a heavy crude. And so for the past few years, Venezuela and Mexico have been on the decline. And so US refineries are looking for replacements, and Canada is the easiest alternative. And then just in terms of there's other factors like the IMO, which you could talk about in the Q&A, which will dampen some of the demand. But overall, because of the supply picture, it looks like there will be very strong demand for Canadian oil for years to come. But in terms of long-term projection for US oil trade, the US expects to become a net oil exporter by the early 2020s. But at the same time, US refineries will still have that demand for Canadian oil. And so just to wrap things up, you know, the cuts so far have been successful. They have helped accelerate a rebalancing in the differentials and the discounts. And so barring any major disruptions in 2019, we shouldn't see the same problems that we're facing in 2018. But ultimately, the problem will likely reappear in 2020 if they can't add Keystone XL by early 2021. And you know, the decision hasn't come without its costs. Obviously, there's some companies that have come out against it, which can have a negative impact on investor sentiment. And ultimately, production growth will be slower because of this dynamic. As I said, though, the demand outlook for Canadian oil is very positive, and the picture on the continent continues to change. And at some point, you know, at the point going forward, the US and Canada, all the crude that they're producing will be going to export markets increasingly because of demand on the continent is very flat. So I'll pass it over to
Can you just, before we lose you, could you say something about IMO regulations, just because
Yeah, sure.
what it means,
Yeah, so,
acronym and all that?
yeah, so, in 2020, the International Maritime Organization will implement stricter regulations on the sulfur fuel content of fuel oil for maritime vessels. And so go from the current level, which is 3.5% to 0.5%. And what this will mean is that refiners will demand a sweeter type of crude. And as I said, Canadian oil is quite sour, and so this will drive demand for the sweeter stuff. But as I said, the supply-demand dynamics are probably going to overwhelm that.
Makes sense. Excellent. Liam?
So as Chris mentioned, my name is Liam Stone. I'm the managing director of Alberta's small but mighty office here in Washington. We're located over at the Canadian Embassy, and I've been here about 6 years. And in that time, Alberta has grown its oil exports to the U.S. by about 1 million barrels a day, or about 40%. And that's despite growth in U.S. shale and pipeline issues. And I've been waiting for Chris's invitation to come and speak about how great we've been doing at our office in growing Alberta's economy. But that invitation didn't come. He invited me over here to talk about one of the trickiest public policy problems we've encountered in a long time. So I think Andrew's done a great job I think speaking about the interconnectedness of our energy systems and the transportation challenges that Alberta's energy faces, and I won't sort of rehash that broader picture, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how Alberta's government came to make the decision to curtail Alberta's energy production. And the story is really rooted in the failure of successive Canadian federal governments to successfully approve increased pipeline capacity. And this left Albertans unable to transport a portion of the oil that we produce to markets through modern, well-regulated pipelines. And as a result, as Andrews went through quite well, we've been selling our oil at discounted prices. As Andrew showed, prior to the Premier making the announcement in December, the price gap had reached historic highs because our production significantly exceeded transportation capacity. And this created a significant backlog and forced the price of our oil to very low levels. Roughly speaking, while everybody else in the world was selling their oil for about $50 a barrel, Albertans were selling their oil for about $10 a barrel. And I think it's important to note that the word our in that sentence. Unlike many parts of the United States, the vast majority of Alberta's mineral rights are owned by the province of Alberta on behalf of the people of Alberta. So like federal lands here in the US or offshore resources, the province leases these mineral rights to producers and collects what's called a royalty on the production. Essentially, the government keeps a portion of the benefit of production, and this provides government revenue. So if this price differential went unaddressed, there were a number of critical impacts in Alberta. Royalty revenue to the government, the profits that Albertans get as the owners of the resource would collapse. Alberta companies would be pushed toward bankruptcy, and good-paying jobs that support Alberta families would have been lost. We estimate that the overall Canadian economy was losing roughly $80 million a day at this sort of high differential, and this was not sustainable. Prior to announcing a production curtailment, the Government of Alberta acted on several fronts. First, the government has and will continue to support pipeline projects by making the case across Canada and the United States. In Canada, this campaign has grown public support for pipelines, as well as growing understanding of the economic damage that's created when energy price differentials are self-inflicted by a lack of federal pipeline approvals. A major poll conducted after curtailment was announced found that the majority of Canadians felt that the lack of new pipeline capacity was a national crisis. And I would venture to say that if the same type of poll was conducted in any other country, people would go, pipelines? So I think the government certainly has done a lot to raise awareness in Canada about these issues. Second, the government announced a commitment to support what is called partial upgrading. So this is partial refining of Alberta's oil that allows more efficient use of pipeline capacity. The government announced a $1 billion incentive for partial upgrading over 8 years beginning in 1920, which includes a variety of fiscal tools, including loan guarantees and grants. Third, as Andrew mentioned, the government announced that the province of Alberta planned to facilitate an additional 120,000 barrels per day of new rail transportation capacity to transport our oil to market. This new rail capacity will start coming online this year, and we hope to have that fully rolled out and in place at some point in 2020. So for the long term, the government is fighting for new pipelines and investing in more partial upgrading. For the medium term, securing 20,000 barrels per day of new crude by rail capacity to provide additional certainty that we can move our resources to market. However, the government was still left with a short-term challenge. Companies made investments in Alberta oil and grew their production based on promises from Canada's federal government of market access. And Ottawa failed to deliver, and as a result, Alberta companies now produce more oil than could be sold or stored. We were extracting about 3.8 million barrels per day of oil, about 190,000 barrels per day more than we can ship. Making the situation worse, as Andrew went through, storage was almost full. It was estimated that there were 35 million barrels of oil in storage. That's about twice as much as would normally be kept on hand. Seeing this short-term challenge, many companies and market analysts called for a temporary reduction in the amount of oil we produce to stabilize the market and address price differential. Before taking this step, the government appointed 3 envoys to meet with energy leaders to work on short-term solutions. They reported back that there wasn't agreement among producers on a voluntary private sector-driven solution. This left the government with a very difficult decision, whether to impose a short-term limit on production that is aimed at stabilizing the market, or stand back and hope that economic forces would rapidly rebalance production with transportation capacity. Now, we know what the government did, but I think it's important to note that prior to the government making its announcement, the main opposition party in Alberta, the United Conservative Party, announced its support for curtailment. And following the announcement, no major political party in Canada, either federal or provincial, leveled any significant criticism of the government's curtailment decision. Now, I don't think I need to tell a room full of smart people at SAIS that's a unique situation in a Westminster parliamentary system. The minority parties in our legislatures are called the opposition, and they're there to constructively oppose government decisions. The fact that opposition did not emerge is significant and speaks to a shared Canadian understanding of the complexity of the situation, the difficulty of the decision, and the stakes in play. While many criticized the federal government's handling of pipelines, virtually no one was willing to claim they had a better approach to Alberta's short-term challenge. So what did the government do? Beginning on January 1st, the province of Alberta mandated a production limit of 3.56 million barrels of oil per day in Alberta. This is roughly equivalent to 325,000 barrels less than what the government forecast for production in Q1 2019. This production limit of 3.56 million barrels a day will match our estimated export capacity while encouraging a drawdown in storage. The government was clear this is intended as a short-term measure, and over the course of 2019, the production limit will increase. The allocation to each company are done through regulation and ministerial order. The process requires a monthly review to adjust as needed so as not to restrict production more than is necessary. In addition, experts from industry are working with government and the Alberta Energy Regulator to refine the rules as needed to make sure there are no unintended consequences. Also, the government exempted the first 10,000 barrels per day of production to ensure that our smallest producers were treated fairly. The Premier was very clear when she made the announcement. In Alberta, we believe that markets are the best way to set prices. But by allocating production limits in a careful way among all producers, industry and investors can be assured that the policy is short-term. We're starting strong to clear inventory, and we're going to ease over time to adjust to where takeaway capacity and production match. And by December 2019, it will end. As such, companies, Alberta workers, and government revenues are protected. I'll close with two observations that are relevant to US audiences. The first is the government's been very clear that Alberta believes markets should be setting prices. The government did not make this decision lightly, and we believe strongly that additional transportation capacity, which we are actively pursuing, will end the need for this intervention. Alberta is not joining the ranks of governments that manage their production on an ongoing basis. Second is these measures are balanced across companies, and the government is very focused on maximizing our exports to the United States. Maximizing our exports is one way we can draw down our volumes in storage, and as such, the policy is fully compliant with our trade obligations. In closing, I'll note that many analysts think this was the most difficult public policy choice to face an Alberta government in the last decade. It goes to the core of Alberta's economy and the core of our public finances. And we are just at the outset of implementation, so we don't know yet how this will play out in the coming months. What we do know is that we will stay focused on increasing pipeline and rail takeaway capacity, getting inventories in balance, and matching supply with our takeaway capacity. These actions have contributed to the drop in the price differential, as have other global circumstances. And Alberta is much closer to getting global prices today than we were at the beginning of December. This is positive news for Alberta. But the Premier has been clear that while we are better off today than we were in November, there is a lot of complexity left to address, and no doubt new external market dynamics are going to emerge over the course of 2019. The government will continue to work closely with Alberta industry throughout 2019 to navigate implementation of this policy and put Alberta's oil sector on a solid competitive footing going forward. So that, I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Before you do, one quick question. Just you talked about investment in upgrading. For people who don't follow the oil sands, can you just explain upgrading a little bit?
Sure.
What that represents?
So as Andrew mentioned, we've got heavy sour crude coming out of the oil sands. So partial upgrading essentially takes that to a lighter, sweeter barrel. And when you are shipping bitumen, what the technology that's primarily used currently is called diluted bitumen. So you take a very light hydrocarbon, blend it with a very heavy bitumen, and that gets you to a gravity that allows you to move it through pipelines. By partial upgrading in the province of Alberta, you don't require as much diluent, which allows you to use your pipeline system more efficiently. Essentially, you're not moving the diluent back and forth in your pipeline system.
Excellent. Professor Doran.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be part of this distinguished panel, and thank you, Chris, for the invitation. I guess I'll try to make 3 points regarding this. The first point will be about where we are sort of worldwide and why we have this larger, in a larger sense, why we have this problem. Then secondly, a comment specifically about the solution that's being perceived, that's being put in place. And then finally, an observation of what I think really ought to be the solution. All right, as far as the worldwide situation is concerned, I think the culprit, if we want to express it that way, is, in this case, is not OPEC, it's not the Russians, it's not I don't know, any other set of contenders. It happens to be, the problem is the vast technological success that we Americans have had in fracking. It is the, and what that really means is that fracking has certain characteristics that are quite different from conventional oil production. One of the characteristics is that the wells are very shallow, and so they're easy to drill. Another characteristic is that the oil is pumped out usually the first year, most of it, sometimes into the second year. quite in contrast to a conventional kind of well. And thirdly, this then involves lots and lots of drilling. Interest rates have been pretty low, so a lot of the small firms and so on could get into this business and expand production. So the upshot of this set of characteristics is that the United States is producing a huge amount of shale oil, especially now that it targets the so-called sweet spots in places like the Permian Basin in Texas. How long this is going to last is an open debate at this point. We all have judgments. It's not going to last forever, that much we know. But it is making life very difficult, and what for the rest of the producers, and particularly for our Canadian friends. The issue here is that when the price goes up a little bit, the frackers expand their production because they can do so very quickly, very easily, very low cost. When the production hits the market, the price comes back down again, everything else being equal, even without mentioning anything about OPEC's not very successful effort at trying to manage this situation. So the price goes back down again, then some of those frackers drop out of the market, and eventually you get to a situation once again where the price creeps back up, and because the market, that fracking market is so responsive, the production increases again. So what amounts to is the world market is a prisoner of what's being done here in the United States, of the success. I think certainly the fracking revolution is an incredible technical success. But so it's a prisoner of that, and in particular, our Canadian friends are a prisoner of this because there's only one of two places where the Canadians can send their oil out. They can either do so across British Columbia, which hasn't been entirely cooperative, with other groups that have very strong specialized interests in opposing this, or they have to send it down into the U.S. market. And the only way they can send it to the U.S. market is to discount this oil very heavily. All right, so much for the general picture. The more specific situation. What interests me about the presentation, the first presentation with my friend from Royal Dutch Shell, we have a common interest in that since I used to do lots of consulting for Royal Dutch Shell. That's a great company. I would just point out parenthetically, the sad truth is that Shell pulled out of its operations. And they were one of the best. I had the chance to walk down into the pit to talk to the managers and so on. They had really an efficient operation, but Shell is going in a different direction globally in terms of its outlook. You would tell more about that than I. In any case, you're out of it. And that to me is an indicator of the problem that people in Alberta have. You know, you gotta attract investment. And it's really difficult to do that in this kind of a climate. But in addition to that kind of problem, I think the question is, why is there so much production? If the market, in fact, has been against production, why is it that there's this, if you look at your graphs, there for the last several years has been just an increasing production, even though the market has not been very favorable to this. So, you know, you're going to have to ask why this is the case. And I have a hypothesis. One of the hypotheses is there's a lot of subsidies which are not, in fact, otherwise shown here, and they have distorted the market, I think, considerably. If you didn't have all that extra production, and of course these decisions have to be made over long periods of time, so it's not, I'm not suggesting that Doran and his simple analysis could, in fact, improve on this, but the decisions are long-term, and they are out of keeping with the nature of the market right now, and that's the reason why you've got so much of a surplus. So what does the government do? I mean, it's in a desperate situation in some ways, but not so desperate politically, since the opposition party agrees with the policy, and that's because the policy is so popular in Alberta. Basically, there are not too many solutions, and anything that looks like a solution will be accepted. So the government is in pretty good position, I think, politically, in making these efforts. what do I think about this in a larger sort of sense? First of all, I am not convinced that this is really a short-term solution. Just by saying that it's going to be over in 1919, at the end of 1919, doesn't mean that it will be. And in fact, there's already a trend in Canada, unfortunately, toward more government intervention in this market, at a time when the investors are all complaining about that, the private sector investors. Example, the Kinder Morgan pipeline was just purchased by the federal government. So I don't know where this is leading, but I think it's leading in the wrong direction. Okay, I think it's not in the interest of the health of the industry for us to go in that direction. You mentioned that the industry is very split. We could go into that. I make a prediction. You can test this out. I haven't tested it out, but I make a prediction that the companies that are against these arrangements are the biggest ones, the best financed ones, and the ones that in tough markets would normally take over the small and not very profitable operations. And the ones who are in favor of this are the ones who are desperately under pressure to try to somehow sell their crude. So I think this solution is an understandable one. I think it's very, very far from a market solution, and it's very much in the wrong overall direction, in the interest of Alberta itself. So what should happen? Well, once again, we Americans end up not on the positive side, at least when you look at this in just strictly in energy terms. What we really should do is finish the last segment of the Keystone. Why is that? Well, because in fact the kind of crude that Canada has to sell is the kind that those refineries in Texas and Louisiana are very good at refining. Now, just one little correction on what was said earlier. It isn't yet clear that the crude which normally comes from Venezuela, which is also heavy sour crude, it's not clear from what the U.S. government has said that that is going to be excluded from the refineries. In fact, Mnuchin just made a statement that the sanctions against Venezuela will not affect the imports of oil from there to the refineries along the Gulf Coast. How are you going to have sanctions and still not restrict that flow is something I don't understand, and I haven't had a chance to clarify. But according to the U.S. government, there's not going to be a cutback. My own judgment is there probably will be cutbacks one way or the other, whether it's described that way or not. In fact, they were more interested, the U.S. government was more interested in saying that there would be no gasoline price increases from the result of its sanctions than the welfare of the refineries and the owners of the refineries. But my own judgment is the natural market solution is to have the Keystone pipeline in operation, and then most of these other problems are going to go away. Why is that not the case? It's because of the uncanny shrewdness of the environmental lobby. They understood that they could not directly stop production of oil in Alberta, but they realized if they could stop the pipelines, they could in fact create havoc. And that is exactly what they've done in terms of the court system. So because this administration would have been very favorable, was very favorable to the opening and the completion of the pipeline. But the problem is that it's in the hands of the judiciary, which of course we respect. It's independent of the other branch, and so it's hard to know what's going to happen. I think there were some statements made that were quite optimistic about how all this was going to resolve itself shortly. I'm not so sure. I think there are just enormous uncertainties here about when that pipeline is going to be constructed, when what the mix of attitudes is going to be. So the best solution, the right solution, the market solution, in my judgment, is to open the Keystone pipeline. I would be charitable and not talk about the Canadian problems of their own Canadian pipelines going through British Columbia, but you know, if there was a little more progress there, that would also solve the problems. But this idea of intervening in the market, claiming that it's going to be short term, not doing anything about this long-term sort of thing, which is investment in production, which clearly is not following the market, because we wouldn't have so much production if it were. Those kinds of things, I think, are not the right direction in which to move. But then, that's easy for me to say, because I'm just an academic. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. And before we lose you, just a quick, I guess, point of information. We are still expecting a provincial election in Alberta sometime this spring, and a federal election on October 21st, 2019, because of fixed election dates. So 2 elections in the middle of the test period for the curtailment. Do you think there's a political dimension to that short-term focus because of those elections?
I was asked the same thing last night on CBC from Calgary, and I said, well, I waffled completely. I said, well, I don't have any information on this. I don't know anything about this. Of course, the answer is, of course, the elections are driving it. But you covered yourself and the government very well, because you said, look at what the opposition is doing. They're supporting this policy too. Why is the opposition doing it? Because it's popular with the Alberta voter, who, they're after all very dependent upon this resource, and they're desperate and they want any solution. And so the government is in a pretty good position. Now, what about the federal government? Well, don't be too sure. The Albertans understand this very well. The federal government is much more the Liberal Party is very much more subject to the attitudes of people in Eastern Canada and Central Canada, all of whom don't necessarily know where their energy comes from. And they would like to see more environmentally friendly actions. And those environmentally friendly actions don't necessarily help very much with the opening of pipelines. In fact, there's a direct conflict here over the issue of whether pipelines should be opened and production should be expanded. So both elections are important. I don't think either election is necessarily a prisoner of this policy, but I don't think either election provides the positive kind of solution that I would like to see, simply because how is the Government of Canada going to get people in the States, here in the United States, through which the Keystone goes, to somehow shape the attitudes of the courts toward completing this pipeline? I mean, that's just, it's not going to happen. Maybe it'll happen by itself. Maybe it'll happen through legal challenges of some sort that I don't necessarily know about. But I have to say, I'm not as optimistic as my colleagues here are, that either this is going to be a real long-term solution or that this so-called short-term solution is going to disappear. I wish I could say it's just a function of the upcoming election in Alberta. I'm sure that this is part of it, but the way I listened to the government, it's going forward with this solution only begrudgingly. But in fact, it's covered itself very well, because the opposition party, which should be, the Conservatives should be challenging this on the same grounds that I have, but they're not, and they won't. Why is that? Because Albertans are so dependent upon revenue from this resource, and they will support anything that tries to correct these kinds of problems. So that's where I stand.
I'm going to turn this over to all of you to give you a chance to get into questions, both to get a better understanding of what's going on, but also to comment, etc. Let me first give the panel a chance to respond to each other. Andrew, do you want to, just anything you want to pick up on from the other presentations?
Sure. Just first for distinction, I don't work for Shell. Like I
Anymore, yeah.
SAIS, briefly worked
Oh,
there.
you were just
Very briefly worked there in the Treasury Department doing boring financial stuff. So
I see.
Boring
I see.
financial stuff is what we're all about, but yes.
yeah. So
That's
I
very well.
would say though that I do think the Venezuelan sanctions will have a big impact. So they're structured in such a manner that essentially U.S. companies can only pay for Venezuelan oil if they put them into blocked accounts in the U.S. that the Maduro government wouldn't have access to. And so already the Maduro government has come out and said that they're not going to send oil to the U.S. unless people prepay for those barrels. So far by what it was listed in the sanctions yesterday and the exemptions, there'll be a slow wind, a brief period of a wind down, but after that it will have a big impact on imports.
Okay, so you're saying our Secretary of Treasury is a liar?
No, I'm not. I think it's just the manner in which it was framed is that they can technically still buy these barrels, but ultimately it's up to the Maduro government now whether they're going to send those or not because of the way in which
You don't
it's
think they would
structured.
send them? They would
They
send
can.
them with the greatest of enthusiasm if there would be anybody who would buy them.
So they can't access the money, the revenue that they get for these barrels, and essentially what will happen then.
Unless there's been an exemption made to allow that to happen. And I continue to agree with the Secretary of Treasury. I don't think there's going to be a very close, very immediate cutback, if any cutback, in oil going to these refineries.
Well, there's 3 months before it comes into effect.
Well, that helps.
Yes, so there's a wind down period that allows some companies, specifically Citgo, is allowed to continue to import, but at the same time, they're still only allowed to pay for those barrels if they put it into a blocked account to the US, which ultimately the government wants to give access to the Guaido government, so they can use that revenue then to move forward. But the Maduro government won't have access, and ultimately what that means is the Maduro government is not going to send the barrels to the US because they can't access those revenues in the most likely scenario.
Well, I think there's another aspect of that, and that is how long is the Maduro government going to be in place? And then we've got a lot of people around the table who probably know a lot about that, but that's an uncertainty.
Yeah, and so it's a completely separate issue, but it in the short term, I think that what we'll see is that it will drive some demand for Canadian oil, given the quality differential. I would also say that there's 300 companies in Alberta. Only 25 of those companies will be affected by the cuts. 25 of those companies produce over 10,000 barrels a day. The vast majority of those companies have come out in support of the decision. The majority of production in the province is in support of the decision. There's 3 companies who it will have a negative effect on their business and their legitimate concerns. But I think the government was left with a very tough decision, and it was, as with all things, it's a balancing act. And the decision was, if we can provide this temporary relief until we can add these pipelines towards the end of 2019 and beyond, then it will be the right decision. But it's dependent if those pipelines do get built.
Well, why are you so optimistic that the Keystone's going to be completed, or much less the other one across the mountains to the west coast?
Yeah, so I think the expectation is line 3 will come on towards the end of 2019. Keystone XL, obviously there's more challenges there, but we have seen recently that the big dynamic is that the Trump administration came in and they're in support of getting this pipeline built. TransCanada is expecting that they'll begin construction come June 2019, and if things do move smoothly by 2021, they expect to bring it online. But yes, there's obviously facing many difficulties, and my guess is anyone's guess as how that's going to play out.
I think Andrew's covered things well. I think the other dimension that I would add is in terms of the increase in production coming out of the oil sands over the last few years. As I said, that was predicated on commitments around pipeline market access. But I think Alberta serves a significant portion of the U.S. Midwest demand right now. The Gulf Coast is the largest heavy oil refining center in the world, and I think Alberta's exports to the Gulf Coast have been growing over time, and I think that's, as companies have ramped up production, they certainly see that as a key market. And I would say, we won't delve too far into Trans Mountain, but I think it's important to note that the majority of Canadians support that project. The majority of people in BC support that project when you look at public polling. And so Alberta producers are also looking at Asian markets as potential opportunities as well. So I would say, as was mentioned, there's long lead times in these projects, but I would certainly say that the growth is explainable given the market opportunities that exist right now. And I think Andrew's point about sort of the industry players that were involved is critical because it doesn't break large small in terms of producers' views on this policy. There's a mix of views and a mix of company sizes within those cohorts. So it's not a clean distinction, I would say.
I have to be the skunk at the garden party on this. First of all, I think there's so many assumptions that are going into this that have been very ably presented, but in fact are glossed over, that we don't know really what's going to happen. We don't know whether the Maduro government is going to stay in power or not. That's a big factor. We don't know whether the U.S. Treasury Secretary is accurate in what he says or whether it's just politics. But it makes a big difference as to whether those refineries on the Gulf Coast are going to have a lot of extra capacity. If they have a lot of extra capacity, they certainly are going to need this Canadian crude. There's no doubt about that. We don't know much about the pipelines and whether that new pipeline can in fact be built that fast and so on. Probably it can, I don't know. But I'm very much more skeptical about the Keystone because it is so much tied up in judicial matters, not matters that the president can deal with. And so how that is going to be resolved is, I think, is very important, but is not clear. And then if you look at the larger question of elections, particularly federal elections in Canada, I'm not sure how that's going to go, because I think the Liberal Party at the federal level has a very strong environmental lobby that's pushing it, that's affecting it, and I just think it's going to have a hard time saying, you know, we're going to make changes that are going to be meaningful in terms of these pipelines in this kind of in this time interval. The only thing I'm certain about is that we have 3 months to figure it out, and maybe things magically will improve in the meantime. What I am perturbed about is this. I'll tell you right now, I am perturbed about a return to Canada of a national energy program in disguise. This time shared at the provincial level as well as at the federal level. Most people here are too young to even know what the National Energy Program was, but it was a grand scheme that was put in years ago to really coordinate policy with a lot of government intervention. And in this case, the Americans, ironically, were on the other side of this, because what we did is we asked for more imports from Canada, and the National Energy Program was actually designed not to do that. Well, we're in a different era now. We've got a different kind of set of government interventions into the market, and I think they're going to be as problematic, potentially, as was this other program. And that's a principal reason why there's not more private sector investment in Alberta, in the energy area, and why a great company like Royal Dutch Shell just pulled out. And it was, I tell you, one of the finest operations there, and one that was very closely coordinated with government activity. Now, I will admit, Royal Dutch Shell left in part because its whole scheme, its whole plan for investment changed worldwide. It's focusing on natural gas because it's so negative and so pessimistic.
And
about
on that
operation.
front, I would note that they also just made the largest private sector investment in Canada's history in an LNG export facility. So we do have them.
Well, that's
And I'd
good.
also add that facility continues to operate just under different owners.
Just
So
different
it's-
And
Anyway.
just for
That's good news.
for all of you, the gentleman who just piped in there, Aaron Annable, is with the Canadian Embassy and represents the Government of Canada on energy issues here as well, just so that they know the weight that your words carry. Two things for those of you who are studying this issue, finding it fascinating. One is that CSIS, Andrew and Jesse, have produced a terrific, with support from Aaron, map that is, some of you will see it on the 5th floor over it. And it is a map that shows energy connections between Canada and the United States. Very handy resource. There are copies available here. Feel free to take one up, take one home. Also, our friends at the Woodrow Wilson Center have done a useful backgrounder on all of this that is available. I have it. If you need it, you're supposed to have copies. I don't have copies, but I'm happy to share that with you as well. It's a fascinating issue. Now, so that's for future. Let me open the floor to questions from any and all of you. Yes?
I wanted to ask a question that's much broader in scope and pulls in some of the national politics, but I'd also be interested in the Alberta political prognosis. Trudeau has had difficulty walking the line between pipeline development and his loyalty to the environmental lobby. But it could be that that's starting to turn. And it could be that as we head into the federal elections towards October, there's a tipping point somewhere where Canadian voters decide that oil pipelines are essential to the health of Canada's oil industry and that the oil industry is essential to Canada's economic growth, especially if growth is being dampened by other forces. I'm curious to know, what do you see as that tipping point? What would it take for various constituencies that oppose the environmental lobby to become more energized and for the public mood to turn so that people want to see pipeline development and they would vote against a party that seems to be standing in the way of pipeline development, i.e. the
So-
Liberals?
I will hold you harmless as a representative of government.
Well, I think,
Just,
I'll jump in as the Canadian on the panel. I think, as I mentioned, the majority of Canadians support these projects right now. The majority of people in British Columbia support the pipeline as well. I think there, as I mentioned, this issue of price differential really, I think, drove home in the Canadian national media the importance of this sector to Canadians. So I'm not sure I would sort of isolate a specific tipping point in the national conversation, but what I would say is that there's growing support and I'd say growing understanding of how critical this sector is to the broader economic health of Canada, and how critical it is in, as I mentioned, you know, royalties play an important role in sort of the fiscal framework of Alberta. The energy sector is a key source of revenue for the federal government as well through corporate taxes, and Canada runs a program called Equalization, which supports social programs across the country, and Alberta is a key source of revenue for that as well. So I would say Canadians are sort of growing in their awareness of the fact that every school, road, and hospital is in some way paid for by this sector, and so the importance of sort of its long-term economic health. It's important not only to the economy, but also to the sort of the social services that Canadians hold dear.
anybody want to add on that?
Yeah, I'd say just briefly, I'm less involved in the kind of political side of things, and maybe Chris, you know, because you're not so much, but I think you know, there's a realization that the movement to keep it in the ground is not playing out effectively in terms of protecting the environment, because ultimately the best thing we can do is to limit demand and increase demand for renewable energy. And so keeping it in the ground won't really resolve those issues, and ultimately the oil is going to flow to markets from somewhere else in the end. And keeping it in the ground in Canada, it's going to come out of the ground from somewhere else. So I don't know if that will play into the broader picture, but I think, yeah, on the political side, we'll leave it to Chris to, if you have any points on that.
And I'll just add one data point that we somehow between the two of us, I think, should have covered, but oil by rail hit a record in the last month that stats are available. 360,000 barrels around per day moving out of Canada. So, you know, I agree with Andrew. It's finding its way, and the numbers, you know, the numbers bear out that there are different options to move.
See, I agree completely with the comments of my colleagues here, the two respective comments. Unfortunately, I don't think it gets to the question that was asked because of something I'll say in a moment. What do I agree with? I agree that the well, I don't want to try to paraphrase what I said, what each of you said, but I agree with those arguments. The difficulty is convincing other Canadians that their welfare is really so determined by Albertan oil. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that I think my experience looking at watching Canada for a very long time is that the people who really understand the energy situation are in the West, particularly to some degree in BC, but certainly in Alberta. And a special kind of energy situation is understood in Quebec because of anything affecting hydro. But the bulk of the people are very much more environmentally oriented in the East, and because of just the way they see things. And the difficulty with that is that the bulk of the population, voting population, is not in Alberta, even though there's some people we're talking about federal elections. So if I look at this from the perspective of Mr. Trudeau, I would have to say, tipping points and so on are interesting, but I'm not going to do any tipping. I've got to deal with all of the Canadians, and that means that the environmentalists figure very heavily, and they have very shrewdly stopped the pipelines through their legal challenges in the United States. I don't see how that's going to change, and it's going to be a tough election if I am going to have to win it on the basis of selling Albertan oil.
You really didn't come here to hear from me, so I'll just add a very, very brief comment, and that is just that, so I grew up in Detroit, and a couple years ago when we were dealing with the automotive crisis, you had a similar problem in that there was an industry that was in a real jam, and a lot of other people in the country, although they enjoyed a car, didn't necessarily buy from Detroit, and didn't necessarily feel it was their problem, but the whole economy was tied up, and it took the Obama administration sort of this, and to some extent the George W. Bush administration, a big effort to remind people of how they were linked to the prosperity of the Midwest and so on. I think it's similar for Canada. A lot of people don't realize how connected they are, and there's going to be an effort for Trudeau or for anybody else to try to let people know.
But I mean, we would obviously like the Trans Mountain process to go as rapidly as possible. I will note that Prime Minister Trudeau's government did step in and purchase that project so that it could continue. So I think, obviously they have a national political lens, but they made that choice earlier last year.
Aaron, you wanted to jump in, sir?
Yeah, maybe I'll just add, walking the line between pipelines and climate policy, I don't think is an easy one for any leader. What I can say is that from the outset, we've been clear that these projects have been taken into account and are part of our climate policy as we've developed it. When we announced our approval of both Line 3 and TMX in 2016 at the same time, we also turned down another Enbridge project that would have gone to the BC coast, and we announced a moratorium on oil tanker traffic on the northern coast of BC. Both of those two decisions continue to cause anger among some constituencies, but that was sort of an attempt at achieving some sort of balance, I think. And I think another factor that, Professor Doran referred to the judicial aspect in the U.S., but in Canada, we have a growing body of legal precedents involving Indigenous groups and land title and the duty to consult. Significantly more precedents that are in the U.S. in that area, and so we're faced with these court decisions and having to significantly address them. And I would say, finally, I will add, because Liam didn't mention it, but it's important to note, I think, that Alberta's oil is produced, I would say, under one of the most, if not the most, environmentally responsible frameworks of any major oil and gas producer in the world, and that's important.
I was hoping somebody would ask me a question that would allow me to jump in on that. So.
I'm not sure what that means, but
Please
it
do
sounds very good.
Please do ask about climate.
Well, it's exactly because of all that legal precedent, exactly because of all those court challenges, and exactly because of the activism of the groups who are bringing those court challenges, never mind the BC government itself and its participation. It's exactly for that reason that global investors are running away from Alberta. So the federal government isn't doing the key energy producing province any favors with this. So that's why I see this as one of the most difficult policy discussions that the Trudeau government is going to have to face in the run-up to the elections. Because as you said, walking that line is not easy, and you lose a lot of support no matter which way you go on it.
Question here, or question, I guess mostly for Mr. Stone, but and it really dovetailing on a comment there. You know, what is essentially the value proposition? If I'm an oil investor, why am I going to invest in Alberta now? I have cheap U.S. shale plays that I can invest in. I have Iraq coming online. I have offshore that's increasingly attractive. Now I've got a supply constrained Alberta, increasing government involvement in the sector, high production costs. What do you see as the value proposition?
Why LNG?
Hey, we support LNG too. So I would say a few things. One, I think it's important to differentiate between oil sands and shale. As was mentioned, shale, you're getting, the vast majority of the oil out of that play within sort of 2 or 3 years. An oil sands facility can go for 30 or 40 years and sort of continue stable production levels. So you're sort of choosing between sort of something that can become a pillar of your portfolio and something that's sort of rapid turnover, and you need to keep finding to replace your production. So I think when I talk to industry players, they're sort of calculating in the long-term value of having a stable supply. And I mean, I think we're talking a lot about Canadian politics, which tends to be relatively boring relative to some of the other investment opportunities that are out there. I mean, Iraq, the Middle East, some other plays. I think while there are short-term infrastructure constraints here, if you're looking at sort of a multi-year perspective, you're looking at Alberta, which is, once you link it into the U.S. infrastructure, is this long-term play with a lot of political stability, access to, as I said, the largest heavy refining center in the world. And I would say that the last few years, with where prices were, with where differentials were, you really had a consolidation in the sector, and you had players running projects much more efficiently than in the past. So I think that people tend to think of the oil sands as a high cost play relative to some other options. I think if you look at more recent numbers, you'll find that it's actually quite competitive on a production cost basis with some of the other options that are out there, especially when you sort of factor in the political stability that's going on in the province. And that's really a function of industry facing a lower price environment and having to go and find those cost savings with their contractors and through technology. And I think, I'll make my climate pitch now. Alberta has one of the most robust climate plans in the world, certainly for a top 10 oil producer, which includes the price on carbon. And what you see is an aligned incentive there where natural gas and energy tends to be one of the key cost drivers for oil sands producers. That also tends to drive your emissions profile. So with a price on carbon, you've got this incentive to reduce your use of energy in your production, and that also drives down your costs. And so you've seen, as new technologies have come on board, you've seen this sort of parallel reduction in emissions as well as a parallel reduction in cost structure for industry. And And certainly one of the key objectives of Alberta's Climate Leadership Plan, and I think one of the key objectives that when you talk to industry broadly, is bringing on new technologies that will see step change reductions, both in terms of operating costs and emissions going forward. And there's some of those technologies that are in sort of large scale test right now in Alberta. The thing I haven't touched on and is that Alberta also has significant shale resources. That's somewhere where Shell is actually continues to play in Alberta. And I think again, there's been a lot of focus on the shale plays in the U.S., but if and when infrastructure issues get addressed, it will be another place where you're going to see companies looking at sort of relatively heated markets in Texas and North Dakota and saying, okay, there's opportunities in Alberta where you've got lower costs of around contracting and some of the other factors.
Getting back to this interesting question about tipping points in terms of environmental and energy matters, the arguments that you made are to me original. I hadn't heard them before. Of course, I'm aware of them, but I just hadn't heard them made by someone like yourself in public. That the rest of Canada should take seriously the fact that through the transfer payments, they are benefiting very substantially from the energy that is being produced, and Alberta is not going to be able to do that even technically if its revenues drop too much. But my question is to those people who know Canada better perhaps than I, how effective would that message be? Would that convince other Canadians in the East, or would it just anger them? How would they? I mean, from an interest logical perspective, they should say, we are also Albertans. We also have benefits from this energy, and we therefore should be supporting it. But is that the way they'd respond, do you think?
I think that Premier Notley's been out speaking in every part of Canada, and we've polled it, and that support's growing. And I think there's benefits not only sort of through federal transfers, but also through employment in manufacturing and banking and all, some of the key sectors in central Canada. And I think people are growing in their understanding of that fact.
I love your term. It's growing. What does that mean? How much? 0.5% or
Well,
significantly?
Again, I can only go back to majority Canadians supporting pipelines.
2,000 miles. Sir.
I have a question on the rail, since that was mentioned earlier. Do you think that there's going to be a limit to moving oil out of Canada by rail with the curtailment? Because now with the differential being so tight, doesn't that kind of undermine the economics of rail going forward?
Yeah, you're definitely right. And so we've seen that rebalancing is back up to, WCS is somewhere around $12, $10 discount at the moment to WTI. And at that level, it's very tight whether rail is economic. But I think because export levels are going to essentially drop by 325,000 barrels a day, that gets us back into the range of theoretical maximum pipeline capacity. And so a lot of that will flow through the pipelines, and some of those marginal barrels will make their way onto the rail, and that gives it a chance then for the inventory levels to draw down, which is the ultimate goal of the curtailment.
I'll say two things about the rail. First of all, I participated in a debate here about Keystone, and I took the very popular position of saying that Keystone should be built against one of the leading environmental lobbyists in Washington, who was very, very good. He claimed I had an advantage because SAIS students were in the audience. But what I used in the argument was that a rail was not such a good idea because the accident level is something to think about, and I had these wonderful pictures of the tankers that had gone off the track in Quebec village. I thought that the people in Alberta in the industry would think that was a great argument, but they didn't treat me very well at all. They said, Doran, the problem is we want to use pipelines and tankers, and so we don't want you criticizing the tankers. I think an accident would certainly change things very substantially. Secondly, the people who are against this curtailment policy, or at least its implementation, say that the problem here is that when you take the pressure off, the railroad companies have no incentive to expand their production because they think, well, the government will just take care of it. They'll take the pressure off in some other way. So I don't know how the current policies will affect the overall transport of an expansion of transportation by locomotive. Let's hope there's not another accident.
Sorry, just
Yeah,
one
sure.
more point out. I do think though that over the longer term it does provide insurance. So the investment in the 120,000 barrels a day ultimately of rail car capacity, as I've shown previously, we get to that point where we're running back towards pipeline capacity constraints. I think that provides some support towards the medium term, that if you face this problem, if they face this problem again, there'll be extra capacity there to take some of those barrels away if we have the discounts break out, which will provide some level of balance.
And I'll just say quickly that, I mean, we disagree on a few things, but I think you've laid out the complexities quite well. And
That's
and
my
this,
job
this,
here.
this is certainly one of them, and it's something, I mean, it's something the government's taking into account as we work with industry on this policy going forward.
Let me come back to you.
Prefacing this by saying I know that different Canadian governments have had different ways of dealing with permitting these kinds of infrastructure projects, what the Harper government did isn't what Liberals are trying to do, et cetera. And I'm still not completely understanding what the current situation is, but how, well, I want to go back to a point you made earlier, Liam, about how successive Canadian governments have failed to bring about the market access for these oil producers. How much of that do you all think is tied to a lack of political follow-through from the Canadian federal government, no matter who's in charge, versus the increased politicization of the regulatory process here, where, like you have on our side of the border, we have judicial proceedings going on now where it doesn't matter where the Trump administration stands because it's out of their hands.
That's right.
So I would say, I mean, I don't want to delve too far into Canadian politics. I think the observation I was trying to make is that these are long-term projects, and I think sort of successive Canadian and federal governments have committed to market access broadly, and I think industry, you know, was taking that into account as they made their investments. I think you've seen different circumstances hit different projects, and I think where the Alberta government, you know, expresses concern is that we need federal governments that are really focused on essentially addressing the issues that Aaron talked about in terms of making sure that consultation's done to an appropriate level where courts are comfortable with how the consultation process has gone. I think going through, you know, the National Energy Board process and making sure that those processes are completed effectively, and that's really been sort of the core of the issue around the Trans Mountain project. I think broadly, the provincial government is also looking for federal governments that appreciate the importance of the sector and are looking at all options in terms of moving this product. So whether that's other pipelines or support for rail, I think sort of putting it center of desk for our federal government is critical, and I think conveying that back to Albertans that this is a national priority. I would say that's not always been the case from our federal governments, and so we're really looking for that to be conveyed, regardless of party.
I have to say, I've been hard on the two governments, but in fact, in many respects, it doesn't matter what they're doing. They're not capable of making the changes. The reason I say that is because on the Canadian side, the powerful interest group of the Native North Americans, they're, and not all of them, just a few, with strong legal precedent, as well as financial support and leadership, they're in a situation where they can block things, and it's very difficult to move them. It doesn't matter what kind of threats would be put into place, unless the Constitution were overridden or something, which is not likely or desirable. And on the U.S. side, you know, the problem now is in the courts. And much of the problem is at the state level, not even at the federal level. So even though the Trump administration can be very sympathetic to the construction of these pipelines, and the Trudeau government can also be supportive, it doesn't matter. It's not in their hands. That's the problem.
I'll just add, for those of you who are not Canadian studies students, just two observations there. One is that Canadian First Nations or Aboriginal peoples, typically nomadic, signed treaties with the former British government that often didn't delineate any sort of land ownership, and that in some provinces, including Alberta, that has now been settled, but in British Columbia it has not. And so moving across land that is contested title, could be Aboriginal, could be not, has been very difficult politically for Canadian governments, and nobody wants to override that, but it doesn't mean you can solve it quickly. And so similar to the situation in Nebraska with Keystone, you have people with land rights or maybe land rights, and settling that as a political question is what you're talking about. So that's only just a backgrounder, really. You know all this, SAIS students and everything. Other questions, comments? Anything? From anybody?
So I'll just
Think you want one? All right.
I'll just jump in then quickly on that Indigenous. I think the other interesting dimension of the sort of Canadian situation over the last year is a growing recognition that there's support for resource development within Indigenous communities. I think sort of the old way of thinking is that this is sort of a binary monolithic interest group, and I think certainly you're seeing not only Indigenous communities that are supportive of projects that are moving through their traditional land, but also looking to become project proponents and sort of equity participants in projects. And I think that sort of shifts what you might assume is the political dialogue in Canada around Indigenous people and resource projects. And certainly in the case of TMX, you know, there's been agreements struck with communities all the way along the route who have agreed to sort of that project going forward.
Could I make one observation? The federal government's position with regard to curtailing, using that term, curtailing of the use of tankers in British Columbia is actually something that Americans were very interested in. I don't think you got any credit for it whatsoever from Americans, from the United States. But in fact, that was something they were very concerned about, because tankers were not just going to go through. If you look at the map, you see that some of that territory is where the tankers are going is American, or on the edge of American islands and so on. And getting those tankers in through that kind of circuitous route was something that people feared would not be easy and would be leading to all kinds of potential consequence. And so the Canadian government stepped in and took care of the problem and didn't get any benefits in return from the U.S. side, I think.
Often difficulty recognition for things that worthwhile Canadian initiatives that don't get.
But you got it at Johns Hopkins SAIS.
You did. Okay, just sort of a last question for all the panelists, and maybe a sub-question. The last question is just, as you look at the year going ahead, what are you looking for in terms of Indicators that the policy's working well, indicators that we're on track. I mean, we're all gonna watch this, it's just started, we've only got a month of data and not even quite that. So as we go forward, what should we be watching to see how this unfolds? Andrew, can I turn to you?
Yeah, I think as the government stated, the main thing is inventory levels. And if they can bring the inventory levels down to the average level, then that should provide enough relief until November 2019, which line 3 is expected to come online. So that's the main thing I'll be looking at from a market-based perspective. If that inventory level draws down, then we'll see the price support.
I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, I think the government has said that we want this to be a fixed term intervention, and I think there's a number of whether it's differential or inventory, certain measures of what's being transported. I mean, there's going to be a variety of numbers that they're looking at, but I think it's ultimately getting the market back on a stable footing.
Yeah, well, I would just say, again, I'm supposed to be sort of the one who takes perhaps a different perspective. Remember, this oil, if the pipeline is built, is going to have to go into, it's going to be pushed into the American market. That means that the differentials are going to have to continue to be pretty strong. And that faces the same kind of competition from shale and so on in the United States that it has in the past. If everything then depends on the world price. The world price sinks, that's going to be a pretty tough market for Alberta to deal with. Let's hope that from the energy perspective at least that this doesn't happen. But I would say once again, very much depends upon what the frackers are doing in the Permian Basin in terms of the impact on the world price and on the price in that Canada will have to face.
It's interesting to grab to Mexico. We never talk about Mexico. Mexico's production's down also, and it's in the same family of crude being a bit heavier and so on, like Venezuela's. But sorry, please go.
I'll let Andrew is the market expert, but I would just say that I think given demand for Canadian heavy at the Gulf Coast, yeah. I think that whatever we can get there, I think will be an attractive option for those refineries.
Yeah, and I think as the government said themselves, that ultimately this curtailment will not affect export levels to the US. We'll still be running at maximum capacity.
We support because that was the pledge in Canada's free trade agreement. Not to bring that up, but that's something that you've definitely kept up with. I'll also be watching to see if Andrew starts getting checks from Royal Just Shell again, because you've been heading so much as their spokesperson. Will hopefully get you some extra money this year. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been as you would expect, an outstanding panel. Would you join me in thanking them for great?